This is week 183 of Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine. I'm Belokur, reporting to you from Kyiv, and I'll be taking you through the top stories from Ukraine this week. This week saw further talks between Ukraine and the U.S., but no breakthroughs were made, and a face-to-face meeting between Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky and Russian President Vladimir Putin has been deemed off the table for now. This week began with American Vice President J.D. Vance claiming in an interview that Russia has made significant concessions thus far in the peace process, crediting President Donald Trump with effectively applying pressure to Moscow. Vance claims that, out of deference to Trump, Moscow has relinquished its demands that it take over control of Ukraine's government, has acknowledged Ukraine's territorial sovereignty, and has bowed to economic pressure from America. So, on the first two counts, Russia's acknowledgement that it can't take over Kyiv and the entirety of Ukraine stems not from Trump's efforts, but from Ukraine's resistance. If Moscow could have, it would have, and we're here because Ukraine didn't allow it to happen in 2022 and in the years since. Likewise, Trump's toothless threats of economic consequences for Russia have ultimately come to nothing. There's truly no weight to the idea that Trump has made Russia do anything at all, as evidenced by the fact that Russia has waged its war even more fiercely in the months since Trump resumed office, and refused to participate in meaningful negotiations towards peace. Kremlin spokesperson Dmitry Peskov said this week that peace talks between America and Russia should remain behind closed doors, and their contents should be kept private. A vague statement that gives little information about Russia's plans, but implies that Russia will continue to convolute the peace process to avoid ending the war. Further statements from the Kremlin this week echoed the long-standing narrative that President Zelensky is an illegitimate leader and no deal can be brokered with him. Again, grim indicators that Russia has no intention of cooperating. Late on Thursday, German Chancellor Friedrich Merz, who had said recently that a meeting between Putin and Zelensky could be arranged as soon as the first week of September, said that such a meeting would obviously not be happening. Russia gave a clear indicator of its attitude towards peace when on Wednesday night it launched over 600 drones and missiles at Ukraine, primarily targeting Kyiv. 25 people were killed, including 4 children. Scenes of damage and destruction could be seen all across the city the morning after the attack, but one stood out as particularly devastating, where a 5-story apartment building collapsed completely. We visited that site to show you the aftermath.
Приблизно десь о 4 годині ночі проснувся від звуків шахедів та вибухів. І через деякий час прилітає ракета. Вікна повилітали, вся квартира в диму, пиль, нема чим дихати. На тому будинку, там де прилетіла ракета, була дитина під завалами. Вона була прижата камінням. Так само ми її витягнули, допомогли. Чоловік, який кричав про допомогу, ми його положили, нога в нього була переломана. Ми змогли чим змогли та допомогли. Да, це страшно. Я був спокійний. В цій ситуації я був спокійний, тому що знав, що нервуватись не можна. Треба допомогти людям, які цього потребували.
Так бахкало. У сусідньому домі під'їзд згорів, люди погибли. Ну, що я можу сказати? Щоб Путін здох, він вже нас так задовбав за 3 роки. Вже нема сил далі так терпіти. Діти погибли. Це дуже страшно.
Я був на коридорі, гукнув, повилітали окна везде. Я тут написав подругі, вона тут живе, 2 сестри. Одна зараз в реанімації, вроді би, а друга в лікарні. Написав їй, що вона, як вона. Вона сказала, що їде в лікарню, що там її сестрі погано, і батьку погано. Сочувствую взагалі. Не повезло, я не знаю. Це взагалі, як сказати, тероризм, так сказати. Живий дом, не за що, так сказати, пострадали.
Like I said, it's hard to take any progress in negotiations with Russia seriously when their actions show time and time again that they have no intention of stopping the war on any front. The Kyiv Independent is a reader-funded news outlet, meaning that shows like this are only made possible by viewers like you. If you'd like to join our community of more than 20,000 members, there will be a link to our membership page in the description below. I'd also like to thank everyone who donates directly via YouTube. Your support is greatly appreciated. On Tuesday, the Ukrainian battlefield monitoring group Deep State Map confirmed that Russia has, for the first time, occupied land in Dnipropetrovsk Oblast. The industrial region located in central eastern Ukraine has seen some minor incursions and some fighting as it spilled over from neighboring Donetsk Oblast, but until now hasn't been deemed a frontline territory or seen any Russian occupation. If you've been following Russia's demands in so-called peace talks, you'll understand that establishing a foothold in yet another region of Ukraine both weakens Ukraine's defensive capabilities and gives Russia another bargaining chip, however illegally and brutally obtained, to hold over Ukraine's head in negotiations. According to Deep State Map, Russia has entered 2 villages that lie at a strategic seam where Dnipropetrovsk Oblast meets Donetsk Oblast to the east and Zaporizhia Oblast to the south. This development draws the front line further into central Ukraine, threatening the industrial centers located in that part of the country. However, Ukrainian military authorities denied that the villages in question were captured, but rather at the center of heavy fighting. In a statement, they emphasized that the villages remained under Kyiv's control and that Ukrainian troops continued to inflict heavy losses on advancing forces. Russia's assaults in and around the villages were reported to consist of small groups of infantry coming in through narrow routes, supported by drones from above, rather than the meat-grinder large-scale assault waves that Russia has employed further to the east, with the aim of overwhelming Ukrainian defensive positions. Western military analysts characterized this new offensive as more informational than operational, believing that Russia is probing Ukraine's defenses and thinning its resources, rather than setting the stage for a new wide-scale offensive. Ukrainian military analyst Ivan Stupak described the maneuver as a secondary objective for Moscow, whose primary goal remains capturing the entirety of Donetsk Oblast. Even if this push remains limited, its implications are dire. The further Russia moves into Dnipropetrovsk Oblast and the greater its presence there, the better positioned it is to launch strikes on cities within the oblast, like Pavlograd and Kryvyi Rih, which are home to key Ukrainian defense production and industrial facilities. And the more resources Ukraine uses to slow a Russian advance in this new area, the fewer it can dedicate towards defending the rest of Donetsk Oblast. Russia can afford to send infantry to attack a new part of the front while continuing its main offensive. Ukraine's ranks, already worn thin, are far less prepared to counter any kind of diversion in this regard. Ukraine's escalating drone strikes on Russian oil refineries and gas terminals have ignited fires, disrupted production, fueled domestic shortages, and carved a not insignificant dent in the Kremlin's wartime economy. We had multiple reports per week, almost every week in August, that another refinery or terminal was on fire somewhere in western Russia, from Rostov and Samara oblasts in the south to Leningrad Oblast in the north. Each incident followed a similar pattern: a swarm of Ukrainian drones bypassing Russia's air defenses, hitting the facilities, and sparking massive blazes that took multiple hours to multiple days to contain. The Kremlin claimed that these fires were put out promptly and damage was minimal. Satellite imagery says otherwise, and so do the numbers. According to a Reuters analysis published on Monday, Ukrainian drone and missile strikes have disrupted roughly 17% of Russia's oil refining capacity since the start of the year. Energy analysts say that attacks on Russia's energy infrastructure have already shaved off more than 4% of the country's GDP. Ukraine's increased focus on hitting these refineries illustrates a big-picture strategy. Russia may have the upper hand on the battlefield when it comes to manpower and supplies, but Ukraine can still target the economic foundation of the war machine, a foundation heavily reliant on energy exports. Ukrainian officials have been frank about their objectives here: to weaken Russia's capacity to finance the war, to disrupt supply lines, and to bring the conflict home to ordinary Russians. As a huge country that's extremely resource-rich and not afraid to drill, oil and gas revenues make up more than a third of Russia's federal budget income. Amid sanctions and Europe's efforts to wean itself off Russian oil and gas, the Kremlin has managed to sustain exports through alternative routes, but Ukraine's attacks are both pressuring supply chains and distorting the perception of Russia as a reliable supplier. The Financial Times reported last weekend that Russia has scrambled to boost crude exports, redirecting raw materials to Asian buyers like India and China in an effort to avoid refining disruptions at home, while simultaneously imposing export restrictions on refined products in hopes of stabilizing the domestic market. These efforts have had limited success. Although crude exports have gone up in August, it hasn't been enough to compensate for the loss of income from refined products. Domestically, the picture is grim. Reports tell of Russian citizens becoming increasingly frustrated with fuel shortages and higher prices, with stories of hours-long lines at gas stations and fuel rationing preventing people from buying even the amount of gas needed to fill the tank on their car. In some regions, agriculture, industry, and transport have been slowed or halted due to lack of fuel. Ukraine's strikes are affecting daily life inside Russia in ways people haven't felt since the 1990s, an energy market analyst told The Guardian this week. In the face of growing dissatisfaction among the public with the downgraded quality of life, which could easily translate to questioning the wisdom of continuing the war, the Kremlin is put in the difficult position of recouping its losses and defending against further attacks, while suppressing public dissent. Emergency imports of fuel additives and spare parts have been arranged from Belarus and Kazakhstan, and Russia is reportedly accelerating efforts to harden refinery defenses with anti-drone systems, even as they're forced to rely on older and more archaic facilities, as more and more modern ones are hit. As I said before, with these strikes, Ukraine is tactically undermining its much larger attacker, economically, rather than on the battlefield. This is a relatively novel form of warfare, made possible by advances in long-range strike and unmanned system technology. A type of warfare where attrition can be invoked in multiple forms, and the war machine can be cut off at the knees, rather than decapitated outright. For our member question this week, we have this from Discord. Speaking of burning Russia down, I do wonder how big a deal the new Flamingo missile will be. If the announced specifications are correct and they are able to soon manufacture 7 a day, it might become a game changer. I'll let a colleague give me a hand in answering.
Well, on one hand, it does look very interesting. It does look like a new capability that Ukraine has not had. To hit some things further away and with greater force than Ukraine could before. On the other hand, I want to be careful with this. Usually long-range missiles have a lot of hype attached to them, and it's important to always remember that they are always a balance between range, payload, accuracy, and cost. And it's very rare that there's usually some kind of miracle weapon that hits all those criteria, and even if they are, there's a question of quantity. So that was when Ukraine got ATACMS. People thought it could change the war immediately, but at the end of the day, it's only an ability to make something very far blow up. So the key battles are still on the front line. It might be a really good tool to put pressure on the Russian economy if more refineries and factories can be hit. So yeah, it's certainly exciting to have this kind of capability if the missile really is everything it says it is, but I just would be always careful about getting too hyped up and forgetting the fact that the real battles, the most important battles, are happening on the front line itself.
That's all for this week. We'll be back next Sunday with more news from Ukraine. If you enjoyed this video, as much as anyone can enjoy this kind of news, please consider becoming a member of the Kyiv Independent community. It's thanks to viewers like you that we can do this work, and we're so grateful for your support. Thanks for watching. I'll see you next week.